Stan, Scobie, it's really nice of you on a Sunday to Skype with me from home. What I want to do today is to ask you, as a scientist, what your take is on a number of questions regarding unconventional horizontal hydraulic fracturing. In particular, you have a detailed knowledge of not just the scientific literature, but also of many reports that have been issued by different agencies, including industry, universities, and governmental agencies, which themselves have not undergone peer review. It seems to me that policymakers at the state and federal level are getting their information on shale gas from these non-peer-reviewed sources. Can you give me an example of one such source and what your concerns are about it?
Sure. Good morning, Adam. The most important report that's getting the most attention right at the moment was published from a institute at the University of Texas. It was, and I don't have the exact name, but viewers can look it up under Groat, G-R-O-A-T, who is the lead author. This was introduced for the first time at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meetings in Vancouver in February to a great deal of media hoopla. And when one went to the University of Texas site, one found a press release, a summary of the report, which was actually the first 50-some pages of the report, and the report itself. And it was titled something like "Hydraulic Fracturing is Not a Problem." That was the intent, and that's the way I read the title, and that's the way that I think most reporters and probably policymakers took it. And it was very interesting because when you read the first 50-some pages, the more or less introduction, what you found was absolutely zero references to any literature, scientific or otherwise. It was simply a very long executive summary, which talked about issues, but really didn't point to things in the report. So I found that a little strange. Then when I started to read into the report, which I believe was about 400 pages long, it is about 400 pages long, what I discovered was several sections are marked draft. I found that very curious because this was introduced as a finished, quote, report at the AAAS meetings. And drafts are drafts and reports are reports. When I looked in detail and marked up the report and looked for specific references, which is one of the ways I read any scientific report. Gee, this is interesting. I should follow this up, read the original, and so on. What I found was in the section, the first section I was reading, that there were 7 references in the body of the text that didn't exist in the reference section. This is somewhat characteristic of draft reports because you don't always get all of the details right. Nevertheless, what it told me that it was really a draft, and that one had to be very, very careful about taking any conclusions seriously. Now, what I then found in searching Google for media references, they didn't refer to this as a draft. They took it as settled fact, which, you know, it might be at some point, but it wasn't at that point because it was a draft. And that was as far as it went. There was an immediate flurry of media activity, hundreds and hundreds of citations, I think presumably due to the push from the Institute at the University of Texas with their press release. And I assume that then policymakers began to take this seriously because, after all, the media said it was a report. The University of Texas site said it was a report, and Professor Groat said it was a report. I thought this was reckless and irresponsible, quite simply. Just no other way around it. With regard to peer review, this gets complicated, of course, because there are lots and lots of reports by lots and lots of agencies. The Congressional Budget Office reports, for example, are not peer reviewed. presumably there's some version of what as scientists we would call peer review, in that I'm sure they circulate them to their colleagues, their friends, people that could make comments. There was no real indication on this report that that was done. I imagine they did some of it, but because it was draft and because it had these internal flaws, and then subsequent, because I discovered Professor Grote had what most people would consider a pretty serious conflict of interest. He sits on a couple of boards of directors of energy companies and brings in from that activity at least $100,000 a year, which was not indicated in the report. That was because I Googled him up, and I guess I followed a trace that somebody else had found about his other activities. This all made it seem like it was a kind of a shoddy operation designed to, a shoddy report designed to influence people, and it was published prematurely. They clearly rushed it out in order to make a big splash at the American Association of Advancement of Science meetings.
Yes, and I understand that by presenting it at that very august establishment, it gives it a certain imprimatur of the scientific community. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The American Association of Advancement of Science is one of the 2 or 3 leading scientific organizations in the world. It's not some state-level thing that people threw together. It's very prestigious. They publish the very prestigious journal called Science, where the very best, very best research gets recorded. So, absolutely, it came across as having an imprimatur of scientific community.
And there has been belatedly some reporting that Grote had these other ulterior funding sources in some of the media. Do you think that that in any way modifies the initial impact?
No, absolutely not. I think the initial impact was within the first probably week or so. Many media reports, other reports, probably other more scholarly reports, probably referencing that report. I have not researched that part of it. And only very recently has there been much media attention to what people would call a conflict of interest, or a possible conflict of interest. That attention itself is very interesting because the media reports now about conflict of interest don't address the substance of the report, which, as I indicated, had problems right from the very beginning. They simply address the fact that Professor Grote sits on some boards and makes a few bucks, actually a lot of bucks, from the energy industry, and the fact that the report was fairly favorable toward shale gas fracking, which is a commonly used term, and so therefore fairly favorable toward the industry. Not a big surprise since this came from the University of Texas.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that this gains a lot of credibility. And I understand that even in Europe, this report from the University of Texas is being used as evidence at the present time.
Sure, I'm sure it is. And I'm pretty sure that the policymakers never get beyond the first 50 pages, which, as I said, don't have the kind of scholarly or scientific substance. That is, they don't have any references. So you don't quite know what to make of the assertions, the analyses, the interpretations that are made in that first 50 pages. This report is around 400 pages. Now, show me a policymaker or a staff member of a policymaker who's not a extraordinarily detailed Wong all those 400 pages. They just don't do it, I believe. They read the first 50 pages, they read the title, maybe they read the executive summary, and that's pretty much it. And it sounds good. That first part, along with the press release, Grote's substantial background and work in the energy field, are enough. And so let's just take the conclusions and not go into the detail to see how it holds up. This is a major problem. I see this happening over and over again. I doubt that it's a new problem. I believe, though, that because shale gas right now is such a big, hot topic, so important to the United States, particularly to New York State and very substantially to Pennsylvania, because that's where some of the most recent developments of shale gas have taken place. That is the drilling, fracturing, and so on and so forth. Pennsylvania is in the midst of this. They've been doing this for about 4 years. They've been playing catch up with their regulations. Mm-hmm. They're struggling, and one of the things I want to get to, if we can in the interview, is Act 13, which was just recently passed in Pennsylvania, and just recently challenged in court on several of its many parts. New York, and this is for other listeners who haven't been following closely, New York is in a de facto moratorium state on shale gas drilling. That's